as we've already mentioned, we have Mr. Falconer, and he is a bencher of the Law Society of Ontario and an author who writes extensively on issues of race and civil liberties. Moreover, he has his own firm, which recently expanded from Southern Ontario into the North, and he practices, his practice takes him to civil, administrative, and criminal courts at both trial and appellate levels, including the Supreme Court. His firm also focuses on Indigenous side representation, including matters relating to child welfare, education, equitable service provision, community governance, and most importantly, the remedies required for reconciliation. So Mr. Falconer holds degrees from the University of Alberta, McGill University, the University of Toronto, as well as an Honorary Doctorate of Laws from the University of Guelph-Humber. So let's give him a warm welcome.
So it's apparent that the skills that you develop as a lawyer aren't necessarily the same ones you would be developing to manage IT. I am hopeful that without any further incident, we will have a chat about what I have the honor to do, and I'm just delighted and thank the folks that have organized today. The idea that you as students would be so motivated as to bring people together and be talking about how to enter our profession as lawyers, I think is a really strong sign of what I perceive to be a very encouraging and useful signal for the future. So what I'm going to talk to you about, the expression we use at our firm and is on our letterhead is litigation with a conscience. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do in the hopes of generating some interest, and specifically with a view to chatting with people that may have questions about the work we do. So let's get started. So first of all, I want to say that we, among other things, have fun at the firm. That is, you know, life can't be about simply grinding it out. There has to be pieces that keep you going. One of the things that keeps me going is that I fly a 182, and it allows me to access the communities and work within the communities. What you see there actually is a ceremony that took place in May when I brought a hearing to the community because of COVID and pandemic. Communities don't have the broadband in remote areas, in this case, Sandy Lake First Nation. This is 400 miles north of Thunder Bay. So we're not talking about easy accessibility. They have internet, some internet, but it's very limited. And more particularly, they're not able to attend a virtual hearing. I got a court order that allowed me to fly in a data stick with the hearing. So after the hearing, I presented it to the family of a child that died, Brody Mikas, a 4-year-old, a very sad case that I was arguing in the courts about a 4-year-old's death that was due to strep throat because they couldn't get the child simple antibiotics. Next slide, thanks. Our practice under Falconers LLP is unique in that it actually spans the province. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to be geography majors, but let me explain, and this map kind of does it for you. What you're seeing is the Great Lakes, and of course, Toronto's way in the south, right? If you look at the picture on the left that I think comes from Google Maps, you'll see where Toronto is on Lake Ontario, and you cross Lake Huron and you cross Lake Superior, looks almost like a wolf's head, and you go way northwest, you're going to get to one of our clients, which is Iskatewizaagegan, some 840 miles. Now, if you went in exactly the opposite direction, you'd get to Jacksonville, Florida if you went south. I'm just trying to explain to people just how big this province is, right? So we have offices that are in the lowest end on the right-hand side picture, and that's just a track and navigation screen on my plane showing us moving across the province. But we have offices in Toronto and in Thunder Bay at the north end of Lake Superior. Next slide, please. And so we have spent time in different places across the province, bringing services to communities. In other words, changing up the model of lawyers sitting in their offices. And so those, you see on the left, one of our lawyers, Molly Churchill, a very, very good lawyer, as is Will, who's on this, who's helping me today. That's in minus 55 on the ramp in Kenora. Just trying to let you know that the work isn't simple, right? Next slide, please. And I want to start now going into the actual cases we do. This is a difficult case to talk about because of what it involves. Specifically, this particular matter arose in front and is ongoing in front of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It's a tribunal argument that we're making about the discrimination against Indigenous children in the child welfare system. The case is called the Caring Society case. In the middle of the case, while we're arguing this case in 2017, two 12-year-olds committed suicide in Wapakika. Now, you that are watching this address today, I'm not sure what your backgrounds are. Everybody comes from somewhere different, and what challenges you've had to endure as you live your life. But suffice to say, most of you and myself and our background do not live with the reality of children routinely, sadly, committing suicide. Children, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. This is a problem in some of the remote communities that has reached very, very, very disturbing levels. In January of 2017, two young girls had a suicide pact, and Chantal Fox and Jocelyn Winter. And in fulfilling that pact, they committed suicide in circumstances where their community had become extremely, extremely aware and extremely alive to the fact that the kids were in trouble, and they'd applied to the government. That's right. They'd actually applied to the government for help. And they'd asked the government for the continuation of funding of a program that they were involved in. The government didn't respond, and the program wasn't continued. And these two youth actually committed suicide. And the government's response was that it had come at an awkward time in the funding cycle. I went to the tribunal. This is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in the middle of the case, and I put this sad story in front of them. Next slide, please. And it resulted in an order from the court that going forward, any applications of this nature were to be responded to by the court, by the government within 24 hours of the submission of an application by a community for children seriously at risk. Could you go back 2 slides to the Choose Life scene? I want you to understand what this picture is, because the name of the orders that we now have obtained that apply on an ongoing basis in Nishnawbe Aski Nation communities is Choose Life. What happened was in February 2017, so the next month after the two young girls took their life, the Winter girl and the Fox girl, from the community of Wapakika, in another nearby community, called KI, Kitchinimagusabinnuik, otherwise known as Big Trout Lake. That community fielded a hockey team. They went to a tournament. While the kids were at a tournament, one of theirs committed suicide. Again, a kid. The players got together as a group and went on the ice, and they had this message that they sent to their brothers and sisters in their communities to choose life. And that's how the name of the program arose. How sad a world is that kids can't just play hockey, right? And I'm talking about this to try to tell you a story about our work. You can go forward 3 slides, please. Next slide. I wanted to tell you a story about our work in fighting youth suicide. Since June 2017, The initiative has created $173 million that has flowed into the communities. This is since 2017. The program has given youth and communities a chance to, and has supported the idea of what we call land-based support, land-based treatment, ultimately land-based activities, where elders, support workers within the community work with kids in the outdoors and start to develop hope. And so this is an example of something that we're proud of, that we had something to do with. I started with this story because what I want to tell you is law is not, law is exactly what you make it, all right? I'm not saying that every lawyer practices in this way or has that opportunity or option, but law is what you make it. I have run murder trials. I have worked in the civil courts. I have worked in appellate courts. And some 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I decided, you know what? I wanted to make a difference in the North with Indigenous people. You have to make sacrifices, whether it's the time with your family, whether it's financial, because believe me, this is not work that pays the way work does in the South. But in the end, a level of commitment, important help from team players like Will, who's on this call right now, Will Perry, very smart young lawyers who helped me out. You can make a difference. And it isn't always true, right, that there's only one way to do business. Another example of the work we do in the North involves my recognition that, oddly enough, the way government funds Indigenous child welfare didn't take into account the challenges faced by remote communities in terms of hurdles and expenses. So I got a court order from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal creating what is called the remoteness quotient, which has directed that funding, right, has to, going forward, index the cost of remoteness. Again, using the court system, right, using the court system to make a difference. In case you wonder about these communities, next slide, please. In case you wonder about these, no, the next slide, according to mine, should be slide 13. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong, apologies, Will, I get it. In case you wonder about these communities and where they are, and I'm hoping, Will, you can pull up the province, go back and pull up the NAPS map. So not go back, but pull up the Nishnawbe Aski Police Service map. Thank you. In case you're wondering, about these communities, it's important to understand exactly where they sit in the province of Ontario. I know some of you aren't as connected to Ontario, but many of you are. You will see, if you look closely at this map, now the shape of this actually looks like Moby Dick the whale, but if you look closely, you'll see where Lake Ontario is on the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll see how large and massive the province is. And in fact, in the north, right, that actually occupies 2/3 of the province of Ontario. Many of you come from the south, which is kind of like the tail wagging, right? The tail wagging the whale. Now, in order to account for many of the realities of providing supports for people in the north, it is absolutely essential that you take into account that to make provision for people, you have to literally convince government, right? You have to literally convince government that they have to pay strict attention to the reality of how disparate and far these lands are. So we spend a lot of time getting court orders and reminding government that when they're making provision for Indigenous people, they have to make allowance for where they are in relation to Ottawa and Toronto. Part of our obligation of reconciliation is to actually force government and to get court orders forcing government to accept and work into funding and work into legislative change where they are. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to catch up for a moment. I've spent some time talking about NAN territory, which is Treaty 9 territory. You're going to go to slide 10, please, Will. I want to speak for a moment about what is called Treaty 3 territory. And now we're moving very close to the border of Manitoba. And I want to talk to you about a community called Iskatewizaagegan, Shoal Lake 39. Again, many of the issues and challenges communities face in these areas, right, are a function of what is going on out there that is so different to what you would experience in the cities. So oddly enough, dating all the way back to 1913, the city of Winnipeg decided it was going to build an aqueduct over 200 kilometers long, right, from city of Winnipeg in Manitoba all the way across to Ontario into Shoal Lake, into this community's lake, because they had nice deep lake, nice clean water. And so they built this aqueduct and essentially made a deal with the Ontario government without ever consulting the community whose lake, the community who sits on this lake, Shoal Lake. They made a deal to take water, and this lake represents the sole source of drinking water for the entire city of Winnipeg since 1913. The numbers are staggering. They take in excess of 100 million liters a day and have completely impacted the community's way of life on Shoal Lake, because these are people whose customs, ceremonies, harvest traditions are very much based on being on the shores of Shoal Lake. So fisheries, ricing, all what are referred to as the sacred gifts of the water have been irreparably changed. We started a lawsuit. If you go to page 10 again, please, Will. We started a lawsuit, a $500 million lawsuit for the water taking. And we are moving it through the courts on an expedited basis. It's another example of the kind of work that we do. Slide 13, please, Will. In making the effort to hold Ontario, we're holding Winnipeg accountable, but we're also holding Ontario accountable for making this agreement to simply give open access to Winnipeg without ever consulting with the First Nation. When we made this argument, Ontario tried to get it thrown out of court. They were unsuccessful. And in the judgment, the judge said something that I just want to share with you, because it's a sign of how we are growing as a society in terms of recognizing the importance of Indigenous cultures and laws, long before we had our conventional law. So Justice Perel, in a case that was just released this past February, said, the law that governs the relationship between Canada and Aboriginal peoples of Canada is what is now known as Aboriginal law. Indigenous law is not the same as Aboriginal law. Both before and after the arrival of European settlers, the Aboriginal peoples in North America had well-developed civilizations that had legal systems and legal customs. Those discrete legal systems are the source of Indigenous law, the law that governs the first cultures as discrete civilizations or civil societies. Stopping there, I'm giving you an example and an idea that the judges have started to realize that they need to change how they think. People, right, can take the law and become agents of change, even in bringing people around to reconciliation and the recognition that Indigenous people have a history that was long before the time we settled. Why does this matter? I'm simply showing you different ways you can use the law to educate and create reconciliation. Go to slide 15, please. In the area of policing, we've had the honor of representing numerous Indigenous police services. These Indigenous police services are grossly underfunded. whereas the rest of Canada has policing that is created by operation of statute, and their funding is decided by operation of statute. Indigenous policing is decided by programs. They're grossly underfunded. Officers don't have radios. Officers don't have partners. Cells don't have heating in the winter. People are dying. So this issue, this chronic issue of underfunding police services has meant people aren't safe, right? And First Nations ultimately are constantly caught in the middle of a reverse tug of war for funding between federal and provincial governments. So we have, next slide, please. We have the honor of representing Indigenous police services in negotiations with governments. We've started to turn things around. We received, over a 5-year period, we negotiated over 100 amendments to a new Police Services Act, which will permit a legislative option for Indigenous police services, so that going forward, legislative standards for funding, legislative criteria for the delivery of safety will be the same as municipal services, while these services retain their cultural responsive mandate. So it's another example of how the law can be used to advance the plight of Indigenous people. And you see me working with police services. So that's an example of me working with them. Here's an example of me not so much working with them, but holding them accountable. And that's the Thunder Bay Police Service. The Thunder Bay Police Service, we set up an office in Thunder Bay in 2008. And what we saw was a very disturbing reality that Indigenous people simply do not enjoy a level of safety in the city of Thunder Bay that white folks do. And it was seen time and again. We brought proceedings in the wake of deaths of youth by the rivers that weren't competently investigated and that were just left unaddressed. We brought proceedings in respect of a case called Stacy DeBungy, who was found by the rivers. Again, the police completely dropped the ball in how they investigated. Why would any of that happen, you ask? Indigenous lives are simply worth less to the police service of Thunder Bay. We got a reports done. You're seeing the Broken Trust report declaring the Thunder Bay Police Service racist. This report was released 3 years ago. There was a backlash from the chief of police. Next slide, please. She complained and said it would be business as usual. This is the chief of police. She cited the fact that these investigations and these reports were making the budget balloon. And all I can say is, I guess racism is an expensive exercise. The mayor, next slide, of Thunder Bay complained that the reports are unfair and they bring undue negative attention. But the actual facts are that almost 3 out of every 10 hate crimes committed against Indigenous people in Canada happen in Thunder Bay, where Indigenous people account for 13% of the population and represent the highest per capita in an urban setting in the country. So our work has been cut out for us. When we looked at the youth found by the rivers, next slide, please, we identified 7 cases that Nishnawbe Aski Nation and the families of these youth asked us to take to court. And so we pushed hard and negotiated an inquest, and that inquest resulted in serious public attention being focused on these 7 deaths. Next slide, please. Similarly, with the death of Stacy DeBungy, further systemic reviews were triggered. In the final analysis, next slide, please. In the final analysis, a report called Broken Trust issued 44 recommendations, and a further report on the Thunder Bay Police Board issued 33 recommendations and fired the entire Thunder Bay Police Service Board. I raise these cases with you to try to explain what I do. You can bring the PowerPoint down for a minute, please. I bring them up because it's important for me when I talk about the practice of law, that I communicate to you that are thinking about going in it, that there are many different ways you can make your mark. There are many different ways as an agent of change you can fulfill your aspirations. There's not simply one way to do the job. I fear that people are limited, obviously, sometimes by their circumstances, right? It's easy for me to say the things I'm saying. You would rightly conclude, well, you know, I have choices today that you may not have. But I would also tell you that I didn't always have those choices, and that I, like many people, had my own challenges. I grew up in a small town in which, being the son of a Black man and a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, did not actually add up in a small French town. I had my own challenges because we were on a chemist's salary, but access to law schools was certainly a lot easier than it is today. I would say that it doesn't matter what job you pick, lawyering, engineering, medical profession, or other finance, business, real estate, whatever business you may choose to do. There's going to be ways you can use these businesses to essentially advance yourself as an agent of reform and a way to improve society. As you have successes as students, which you will have, right? As you have these successes, you have to be always saying to yourself, and I understand people's lives get complicated, so it's not always good news. But when you have good news, and that happens, right? And you have family, support people around you, who have friends, whoever give you that important support, part of the exercise is honoring what they give you, honoring that support, honoring that help, and recognizing that with that help comes an expectation of you giving back. And so as you go forward, which you will, and you succeed in whatever you do, just try to keep in mind it's important to give back. However that form that takes, it doesn't have to be about flying in the north, right? But you need to keep in mind that, to whom much is given, much is expected, and it's true. And so if you are fortunate enough to obtain access to the legal profession and end up as a lawyer, I encourage you to remember that. The power of empathy, the ability to speak to issues of change and improvement are part of the arsenal that you will have when you join this profession. It's going to be about whether or not you exercise it. It's never easy. It takes imagination, it takes innovation, it takes the help of others. But at the end of the day, don't ever forget that it is truly, truly a helping profession. And as a helping profession, you have to actually help. All right. So thank you for the honor of being able to speak to you today. And I meant to say at the start, so I say it now. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, and I'm very lucky to be doing so. And when I speak to you from Toronto, I recognize that it is the traditional territory of the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation. Toronto is actually a Mohawk word for where trees are standing in the water. I just want to acknowledge that I am speaking from that First Nation territory, and I want to recognize the long history of all the First Nations in Ontario and the Métis and Inuit people, and thank them for letting us live in their lands and sharing them with us in peace. So thank you, and real pleasure.
Thank you so much. We actually do have some time for some questions. I know we're going to go a little over time, but that's okay. So if you have any questions for Mr. Falconer, please drop your questions in the chat or send them directly to either Amy or me, and we will ask Mr. Falconer the questions. And Mr. Falconer, if you want to also check the chat as well, if you want to do that, that's totally fine.
I don't know how to check chat.
Okay, we can facilitate.
It'll be a lost. Will cover all of that.
Okay. Will, would you like to check the chat, or would you like us to facilitate it?
It might be easier because I know there's other questions as well if you just want to ask Mr. Falconer.
Okay, great. So we'll go through the chat first before So someone asked, can you tell us a little bit about a day in your work, how your day in work looks like?
Okay, so let me pick pick a standard. Let me pick literally this week. So today is Saturday and I'm talking to you. That's not unusual that the weekends have some kind of public presentation piece. Not every weekend, but not unusual, as will tell you. So I arrived back in Toronto last night at 10 p.m. I flew from Thunder Bay. You saw the distances. I showed you those distances, right? So I left Thunder Bay in the afternoon. The day before, I had been in Sachigo Lake. Sachigo Lake is a further 3-hour flight north of Thunder Bay. I spent the day there meeting that community, assisting with a community feast. My way of assisting was eating the food. I had moose meat and fish, and but I also spoke to them about Choose Life. They wanted me to speak to them about that, and I met with them and community members. The Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm just going backwards in my week. Some may not know this. You may have seen it in the news. The election for the Assembly of First Nation for National Chief, the leader for the Indigenous people, was this week. I was on a campaign team for one of the people that was a front runner. Unfortunately, he did not succeed, Alvin Fiddler, but there you go. So that was Tuesday and Wednesday. And on Monday, backing it up, I was in Shoal Lake. You remember that water case? I was up by Kenora working with the First Nation on Monday. So that's what my week looked like this week. I had to go backwards just to keep track of it. So I'm a very lucky guy, right? I have a team that helps me, and extremely blessed that I get to do this work.
Well, that's indeed a very interesting week. All right, the next question from Eliza is, can you tell us more about when you represented Adam Nobody and the Free Press 4 in relation to their unlawful beatings and arrests during the G20 summit in Toronto?
Sure. And this will interest you folks. So that happened, the G20 piece, I believe, was 2012, 2013. How do you guys even know about this? You were babies. So the reason it's so interesting in the context of who I'm speaking to today is that right in the middle of the protests, I was a guest speaker for St. Michael's High School for their convocation graduation. I was delivering the keynote. And my keynote topic, because the protests and the fires and the violence were going on as we were speaking in this hall, because remember, it's not pandemic, it wasn't virtual, it's real. So there's 1,000 people. Now, my kids, my boys graduated from St. Mike's. My wife is Catholic, and more importantly, my mother-in-law was the first woman teacher there, and it's a school up the street from my house. But the bottom line is I was speaking about how it's tempting to tell your kids to stay home, to insist as parents, because you've got all these parents in the audience, right? It's a graduation. So they're all there proudly about their children. But I was telling them, as a lawyer who thinks it's essential that kids get engaged, I was telling them they can't keep their kids in a safe bubble forever. And they have to honor those kids. You know, there may be kids who don't want to leave their home. But at that time, I remember saying to parents and to the kids, they have to leave the bubble. And that means going down and learning what's going on down the street from you right now as we speak and participating. Adam Nobody was somebody who had a joke sign up, and he got jumped by the police. Thank goodness there was a video, and so we were able to hold police accountable in respect of that case. Next question.
Okay, so I think Esha asked a question, or well, she had some background information. As an Ontario citizen, it is really disappointing that we are only recently learning about these current living conditions of Indigenous peoples, and only to realize that is only a fraction of our history's documents, with the recent findings of the unidentified bodies within our grounds. And with the absence of the 2021 Canada Day, would you say our society has become more supportive of these Indigenous communities, or that this can't only be a once-a-year cancellation and we should eradicate these Canadian tropes that misrepresent the history of and culture?
What is the name of the person that asked that question?
I believe it's Esha, but I might be pronouncing it wrong.
Can Esha tell us how?
Isha. Sorry.
Go ahead, Esha, speak.
My name's Isha with Isha.
Isha?
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Isha.
Nice to meet you too. It's a pleasure.
So Isha, how old are you?
I'm 16 years old.
That's crazy. How could you ask such a smart question? And I'm not actually joking. I take such great comfort in the level of engagement and interest by young people today. So our future is very much dependent on people like Amy, like Isha, like Lauren, actually stepping up. We've messed it up, right? As settlers, we've messed it up. So you need to fix it. It sucks, right? But every day that goes by where you don't do something, it's on you now. So I'm trying very hard. Will is trying hard. Will is Indigenous from Fort William First Nation, but we're all trying, right? But we have a responsibility to recognize that trying's not good enough and that we have to genuinely throw ourselves at the issue. That means respecting our Indigenous brothers and sisters and asking them what they think we should be doing, honoring them, and being supportive of them, not prescribing things. And I suffer because I'm an obnoxious big mouth lawyer. Sometimes I prescribe things in a way that I should shut up, but I try to remind myself about that. But it's a very good question, Isha. This isn't just platitudes. I am seeing some change, no doubt about it. I did the Ipperwash Inquiry in 2004, and the world looks different 17 years later. We talk more about reconciliation, but we have so much work to do. People continue to die. Children are dying. Failures in the system continue. Colonialism and racism are alive and well. The Thunder Bay Police still run business the way they did 5 years ago. It's just more people are seeing it. So lots of work to do. Don't doubt it's just Indigenous work. I can talk to you about the DeFonte Miller case in Toronto. I don't know if some people you know about it. Steel pipe was used on him and he lost his eye from police officer, an off-duty police officer. Lots of bad things happen places and lots of good things happen in places. I do believe that there is an awareness that wasn't there before, but we have lots of work to do. Next question.
So we have a question from, let me just check the name, Kamo. I'm so sorry for butchering your name. They ask, how has the legal profession itself changed from when you first joined it and now?
I think the legal profession looks different. So just like we see diversity on this screen, you're also seeing diversity in the legal profession. The power brokers, like the big law firms, when you look at the teams that run those firms, the senior partner teams, they don't look so diverse, right? So there's a real challenge in penetrating through to the top, but every day it improves. But racism is alive and well in the legal profession as it is throughout society. So I know, sadly, some of you, maybe even many of you, have personally experienced racism. The legal profession is no exception. In some cases, it's worse. But it has evolved, and it's easier to empower somebody today than it was yesterday. And so we create some institutions to try to help, but it's a slow process and it's very frustrating. Doesn't mean I don't want you to do it. It's a great idea. It's a good job. Do it.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, maybe we can end off with one last question. And this question is from Dorna. And she or he says, as the future generation, what can we actively do to help improve the conditions of the government and the various legislations in general?
So that is a perfect question for my colleague, Will Perry. So Will, you're gonna have to turn your camera on and your mic on, and I'm getting him by surprise, folks. He had no idea I was gonna do this to him. Isn't this great? It's fun being in charge. So Will, join us. Thank you. This is Will Perry. He's the brains behind the operation here.
Can you repeat the question, please? I apologize. There was a bunch of chat messages popping up.
It's all right.
I guess I can repeat it.
Yes.
So Dorna, they say, as the future generation, what can we actively do to help improve the conditions of the government and the various legislations in general?
The conditions of the government. Yeah, I used to work for the government, and I worked on the opposite side of Falconers LLP, actually, for some of these cases that Mr. Falconer had spoken about for the 7 Youth Inquest. I defended the government. I wrote our CEO's testimony defending the practices of the government vis-a-vis these children. And I could say that I'll keep it short, one big improvement is the theme of diversity. I was one Indigenous person in a team of 56 people for the agency I worked for, and there was one other Indigenous person. We were a team of 2, and we filled Indigenous roles. We were Indigenous liaisons, and those were the only Indigenous people in the organization. And a big thing that I think needs to happen is that we need to have Indigenous people, speaking because I am Indigenous, in all sorts of roles. Don't just have Indigenous people filling Indigenous roles because they're Indigenous, teaching Indigenous courses because they know about Indigenous things. It's the same thing, we see it in film depictions. Indigenous people play an Indigenous character who knows about spirituality, and it's tokenism. And that is one serious way. And have it in leadership. Indigenous people represent 15 to 20% of the population in Thunder Bay. And I can take a look at the hospital CEOs, and we have cases against the hospital. Indigenous people aren't 15% of the leadership in our institutions, in our hospitals, in government, in City Hall. So that is one significant way that I think we can improve the conditions of government and of Indigenous people and other minorities as well.
You see that, folks? He should have done this whole thing. I don't know why the heck I didn't just get him to do the whole thing.
Thank you. No, I truly believe it. That's why I'm very, yeah.
Thank
Great
you
answer,
so
Will.
much. Yes, that was a great answer. All right, thank you so much, Mr. Falconer and William, for that amazing keynote and all the answers to all those questions, and about how lawyers can make a difference in the world today. I'm sure the attendees were very inspired by the work you do and will probably continue to try to make the change as you've asked us to.
If you want to learn more about our firm, our website is falconers.ca. So FALCONERS.ca, falconers.ca, if you want to learn more about the work that we do.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank
Have a
you
good
so
day
much
and have a
again.
good conference. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Miigwech.